Today on Public Research,
they're not interested in Arabs dying in Syria. They're not interested in Nigerian Christians being kidnapped by Boko Haram. They don't actually care about human rights crises. This narrative that they care about human rights is garbage from A to Z, because the only thing they care about is how to demonize the Jews.
Rabbi Yaakov Menken, Executive Vice President of the Coalition for Jewish Values, the largest rabbinic public policy organization in America, on the surge of anti-Semitism since October 7th, battles over campuses, the state of the U.S.-Israel relationship, and internal relations between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews in America today. On a scale of 1 to 100, in the year 2004, where would you have put anti-Semitism in America?
From 1 to 100, I mean, in 2004, maybe a 20.
Okay, and today, 2025, where would you put it?
70.
Wow. That's scary. Yeah, it's scary.
It's a very different world than it was in 2004.
I think it would be irresponsible to ignore the fact that Kayne West has released a new song called Hail Hitler, and it's being played, it's getting millions of views. I couldn't listen to it, it's too disgusting, but I heard the lyrics are, these people took my kids away from me, and then they took my bank account, and apparently it ends with a Hitler speech. I mean, did you ever think we could get to this point in America?
Well, I'm not thinking that Kayne West is the exemplar of that. I didn't think that we would have actual Nazis in Congress in America. That's just not something that, we put on the bingo card, as it were. But, Kanye is also regarded as, having gone somewhat off the deep end. So this is just him going further off the deep end. But the fact that, a whole team of people would help him record that and put it together, and they're not walking away going, no, sorry, this is just too much for me. This is too disgusting. I'm not going to be part of this. It just kind of shows where society has gone.
What have you been surprised by, if anything, since October 7th? Or did you have a pretty good anticipation of the immediate, declarations of genocide and et cetera, et cetera?
No, I would not have imagined that 30 student organizations at Harvard would blame the Jews for being killed. I would not have imagined Students for Justice in Palestine. You might have thought they had a speck of decency, or at least subtlety, that they would at least do the pro forma condemnations of Hamas. No, instead they declared their support for Hamas, that they were part of Hamas. There are war crimes continuing to go on right now, being committed by Hamas, and every member of Students for Justice in Palestine is part of that.
I wonder what you make of the amount of Holocaust inversion we see. It's all over, of people saying Zionists are the new Nazis, of calling Israeli Jews Nazis, and they seem to get a deep pleasure out of that. Why do you think that is?
Anti-Semitism begins with this idea that the Jews are a threat. It's the Jews versus the world. And the Jews are taking advantage, and the Jews are taking control, stealing from the non-Jew, first of all, but is taking advantage of them in every way. So, this view of the Jew as a threat is nothing new. It's never been sane. And it's, we have biblical models for this. It's something that, of course, there's this aspect of projection. The abuser in every relationship claims that whatever his problem is actually the problem in the other guy. So, every time, whatever they're accusing Israel of, apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing, all of these are things that the Arabs have done or want to do to the Jews. And of course, their anti-Semitic supporters in the West are right behind them.
Do you agree with me that U.S. aid to Israel, however well intentioned, has been almost like heroin? That it would be better if Israel became less. I was just struck by after October 7th when there was some vote over Iron Dome or some supplies that we were sending to Israel. How much I would have loved somehow if Israel hadn't had to be in that situation. Because I remember watching these protesters and thinking, these people shouldn't have any say about Israel's ability to defend itself. What do you think?
Great, but Israel's not going to be able to afford the precision munitions on its own. Those are more expensive. So if the United States is not involved, more people are going to die because, the 1970s munitions did not have the ability to take out a particular room in a building. And by the way, the Americans for themselves would never have learned how to do these things if not for the Israelis. There's a very symbiotic relationship between the Israelis and the Americans in terms of the Israelis being a testing lab for improving these devices and making sure that they have the necessary precision. So, on the contrary, in every other situation in the world where the United States is a peacemaker, you've got U.S. boots on the ground. You've got U.S. troops in Japan, in various islands in the Pacific, in Korea, and until the end of the war, in Vietnam, still in Germany, in Taiwan. In Israel, not necessary. In Israel, they exchange. There's an exchange of information and troop, but all of the military combatants who are serving to serve the bastion of freedom in the Middle East, and thus the target before all of these barbarians would move on to their next target, which is America. The target thereafter, the Israelis say, no, we don't want you to fight our battles for us. We just want you to help give us the tools necessary to do the fight in a civilized and professional way, and that's what's going on.
This is a difficult question. I have a Israeli friend who basically said the difficult truth about Israel is this: that basically in 1967, Israel made a fatal mistake in creating these two limbo regions of Gaza and the West Bank, and that it would have just been smarter to simply, for lack of a better phrase, do more population transfer and these people go to Jordan and Egypt, and then the whole conflict could have been avoided. Do you have any thoughts on that?
The problem with that is that the civilized world would never have stood for it. The Arabs are allowed to do that to Jews. Jews are not allowed to do that to Arabs. It's a complete double standard. I mean, obviously, you look at 1948, Jordan expelled all the Jews from the territory it controlled, including the old city of Jerusalem. People were thrown out of their homes. They had to go make new homes in the western portion. And yet, when Israel comes back, it went so far as, there's this neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah, where there's a big conflict about the fact that the Israelis are supposedly throwing Arabs out of their homes. What really happened is that those are homes illegally occupied by Arabs, where the Supreme Court said, oh, they can keep those homes as long as they pay rent to the rightful owners. And they've not been paying the rent. And so there's this big conflict about it. But, the Israelis want to be civilized. The Israelis don't want to be a bunch of barbarians. But the other problem is, quite simply, they cannot give these barbarians the vote. It's not as if the Arabs among themselves do big and do well with democracy. That's just not a thing. Look at the Arab world, with very few exceptions and very unstable exceptions. These are not democracies at all. And the Palestinian Authority is nowhere close to a democracy. Pretended it was a democracy, started as a democracy. Mahmoud Abbas is now in the 18th or 19th year of his 4-year term. How'd that work out?
I wonder, when you look at vicious anti-Semites, do you feel, there's Amalek, there's people talk of the spirit of Amalek, and do you believe that there is this sort of spiritual dimension towards these people? They have this spirit.
Call it Amalek, and I'm not going to say that it's a spirit, like the spirit of the people. Is this are these the intellectual descendants of Amalek? For sure. I mean, obviously. This idea that the Jews are a threat and we're going to attack them irrationally and we're not going to, look at, if you even take the slightest rational look at what's going on, the Arabs in Israel flourish. They're much better off than their compatriots anywhere else in the Middle East. I mean, for sure, unless they're the ruling class. The ruling class, the sheik who controls the place, great. He has a great life. But everybody else, they have no liberties. They have no independence. They have no vote. They have no say. Whereas in Israel, look, Israel is a completely different world. They talk about the horrors of this brutal occupation. Oh, okay. So why is it that a resident of the West Bank has a longer projected lifespan than a Jordanian? Why is it that a resident of Gaza, the residents of Gaza have a longer lifespan than an Egyptian, and these leftists are accusing Israel of genocide? That's irrational. That's stupidity.
Actually, it's. Did you know this fact? Before October 7th, do you know Gaza had a higher life expectancy than Mississippi?
I did that. I did not. Yeah. That I did not know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying Gaza had a longer projected lifespan than Mississippi in the United States. That's very good.
Yeah, versus 70.
But it's the point. The key point is, for comparison purposes, it's 2 years longer than an Egyptian. So if the Israelis are doing a slow genocide in Gaza, that means the Egyptians are doing a fast genocide on their own people.
With the genocide, here's the thing I think proves they don't believe the allegation. Look at the people who allege it and look at their Twitter and see if they have ever demanded Egypt open up the border. They never do.
No, of course not.
Which makes no sense.
They could none of these people do not care about civil rights at all. You've never heard them talk about the fact that a Palestinian Arab in Lebanon cannot go to college, cannot get a white collar job. They do not talk about what happened to Palestinians in Jordan. They do not talk about how Palestinians are treated in Kuwait. Unless they're talking about Jews, they don't have an interest. They don't talk about it. They're not interested in Arabs dying in Syria. They're not interested in Nigerian Christians being kidnapped by Boko Haram. They don't actually care about human rights crises. This narrative that they care about human rights is garbage from A to Z, because the only thing they care about is how to demonize the Jews.
As you know, I think for many Jews, their Jewish identity for many was awakened after October 7th. I have a friend who's from a Reform background, and he's become much more interested in Jewish texts and the whole thing. And he lives near a Orthodox synagogue. And he said to me, I would like to go over there, but I'm just so scared that they're going to reject me, that they're going to castigate me for, I don't have kids, I wonder what you would say to that person.
That, indoctrination did not start recently. For years, I grew up in the conservative movement. And, so I can tell you, there was always this idea. I mean, for all that they imagine that Orthodox Jews look down at them. There is this absolute vision in their head that is taught to them from the beginning. Oh, the Orthodox look down at us. The Orthodox don't think we're real Jews. The whole conflict in Israel over who is a valid rabbi to do a valid conversion was always called, who is a Jew? Why would they cast it that way? Because they wanted their non-Orthodox flock to believe that the Orthodox perceived them as not really Jewish. And of course, that's a profound individual insult, et cetera, which of course it would be, but that's not true at all. I mean, that's completely off kilter. At least it was a couple generations ago. Now there are so many people in Reform congregations and even conservative ones who have no legitimate conversion or descended from people with no legitimate conversion. So they're actually not Jewish. But that's not a problem that the Orthodox created. That's a problem that they created. We know that because, you go back 200 years and everybody observes Jewish law. And Jewish law says this is the standard for conversion. This is the standard for what it means to join the Jewish people. And if you don't meet that standard, then you're not doing it. Okay, so along comes the Reform movement and says we're changing the rules unilaterally. And then they go, and you don't accept us. The Orthodox, you don't accept us. It's your problem. It was never the Orthodox problem. The Orthodox don't have labels on what's a Jew. There's Jews at various levels of observance. There are various levels of correct ideology. There's various levels of learning. But, you don't peg Jews based on all these individual categories and things. You care, is the person Jewish or not? And if they are, you want to invite them in. You want them to get into learning. You want them to get into Torah. So your friend has nothing to be afraid of. Obviously, in Borough Park, where every single member of the congregation is wearing a round beaver hat and a long frock coat, and Ezra Tzitzis outside, I'm not going to look in place there. So why, how's he going to look in place? And he's not going to feel in place because he doesn't look in place. Fine. But that's just, that's appearances. And I pray with congregations where everybody looks like me, and I pray with in congregations where nobody looks like me.
I feel like with him, he feels that he would be intruding. How would you advise someone like that? What do you contact the rabbi? Take them out to lunch,
Talk to the rabbi first. Talk to a congregant first. Don't be afraid. Show up one day. Find somebody who's in the congregation. Have him bring you. It's not hard. It's not nearly as threatening as he's being led to believe.
There's been so many rabbis in the history of Judaism. Who do you hold in sort of highest esteem?
Well, you hold them all in high esteem. But you can't imagine the stature of, the Vilna Gaon or the sages of the Gemara, their level of knowledge. I mean, I know one Rav here, in America today. I once called him up with a question about, something somebody had pointed out to me about a statement, an argument between two of the early, the Rambam in his Code of Jewish Law, Maimonides, has a whole code of Jewish law, and there's a commentary, the Ravid, who argues with him on certain things, etc. And I once called up this Rav with a question about one of those arguments, and he didn't open the book. He didn't say, let me research that and get back to you. He immediately told me what the argument is about and what's going on over there. And without having to look at the text at all. He just knew it. It's amazing to meet people who are of that, in that situation.
It must make you laugh when anti-Semites think the Talmud is one little book.
It takes a little book to have all the quotes that they want to take out of context.
Yeah.
Exactly. Out of the 7,004, whatever that is, the number of pages is quite extreme.
Yeah.
It's not probably not 7,000. It takes 7.5 years to go through it. But that's 365 times 7.5, and those are two-sided pages. So it's double that number is the number of pages. It's crazy.
How strong do you feel the U.S.-Israel alliance is? Because I think Trump is obviously a friend of Israel. But there are movements in the GOP that are more anti-Israel, Tucker, Carlson, et cetera, et cetera. Do you worry about that? Or
I would worry much more about the Democrats taking control again. as far as that goes. I mean, as far as politically, it should not be as we should not be in a situation where support for Israel is a partisan thing. But it's not the Republicans' fault that it's become a partisan thing. Tucker Carlson and Kanye West are not in the government. They have, they can say what they want in the street, but they have limited power and limited sway. When you're talking about the people who are in the government, that's much more of a serious situation. There are some Republicans in Congress that are not so friendly, but overwhelmingly, the ones who are the ones who are close to the administration, the ones in power, etc. And I was just having a conversation with staffers for the Education and Workforce Committee. These are people who are very dedicated to preserving Jewish life and preserving Israel and getting universities to restore sanity to the campus.
If there was a Russian student in Columbia who was taking over buildings to promote neo-Nazi terrorist group propaganda and his green card was revoked, you think we would see all these protests about that?
The fact is, Randy Fine, Representative Randy Fine, new member of Congress, he made basically that point to the president of Haverford in this most recent round of hearings. He said if there was a student out in the middle of the square holding up a sign that said "No blacks on campus," would you allow him to stand there promoting that ideology? And, it was obvious, you didn't even have to wait for her answer to know that they would never tolerate that it's total hypocrisy, that, if the guy who simply said no blacks on campus, that's not tolerable, but calling for the genocide of all the Jews, that is tolerable.
Yeah, or the more analogous...
From the river to the sea. I mean, what is it that Palestine is not? Palestine is far more free than all of its neighbors. The only thing it's not free of is Jews. So these are calls for ethnic cleansing where they can dress it up however they want. But that's the bottom line.
We are seeing a disturbing trend. I'm a Democrat. I know you might not like that. But I call out all the anti-Semitism I see. There's a very disturbing move with DSA and some of these groups where they want to have these bans on Zionists.
Oh, yeah.
And they're, no Zionists allowed, or they'll put roommate listings. Everybody's welcome, but no Zionists. How do you respond when these people say, no, I love Jews. Jews are welcome. I didn't say Jews. I said no Zionists.
Opposition to Jews begins with opposition to Judaism. And opposition to Judaism means whatever Judaism believes, you believe the opposite. These guys do not care about Zionism. They certainly do not care about the policies of the Israeli government. The only government policy they object to is that the Israelis don't allow themselves to be slaughtered. That is the government policy of Israel to which they object. That the Israelis don't let themselves be slaughtered and won't allow their citizens to be slaughtered, will defend their citizens, will rescue their citizens, like from hostages. What they're calling a genocide is a hostage rescue. And by the way, that's disgusting. I mean, obviously, that's an ongoing war crime. As far as, I would cure you of being a Democrat by inviting you to go watch the hearing that took place last week of the Education and Workforce Committee. Haley Stevens is the one Democrat who showed up and said, this is not an unreasonable obsession. This is not a false obsession. It's good that we're having these hearings, and the fighting anti-Semitism has to be bipartisan. Every other Democrat, everyone, wanted to talk about January 6th. We're talking about the presidents of 3 universities sitting in front of them who allowed major anti-Semitic activity to go on their campus. January 6th has nothing to do with that. Doesn't matter if you think it's relevant somehow to anti-Semitism or not. It certainly has nothing to do with the 3 representatives of the universities sitting in front of them. They wanted to bring up Charlottesville. First of all, anybody who can understand the English language can watch and read and know that Trump never said, he said the neo-Nazis should be condemned totally. That when he was talking about the good people on fine people on both sides, he was referring to people debating the removal of Confederate statues. But I'm just saying, I just want you to understand the Democrats kept bringing that up again and again, even though it's been debunked completely, and again has nothing to do with the witnesses sitting in front of them. And then you had the folks saying, "Isn't it terrible that Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, Elon Musk, is firing all of these OCR divisions that didn't do their job?" That when they were tasked with the job of combating anti-Semitism and rooting out discrimination on campus, they never concluded investigations or made these ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous settlements with some of these universities with no meaningful consequences, like Rutgers, and all of that stuff. And to compound that, then you had, I mean, I don't even remember what Ilhan Omar had to say because she's such an idiot. But you had this guy, Kassar from Texas, and he said, in amongst his remarks, that Trump is the most anti-Semitic president ever. Gee, it's like, don't tell the Orthodox community that, because that's not flying over here. But he believes that he knows better than the Orthodox Jewish community and the Orthodox Jewish rabbis what an anti-Semite is. I think we have a name for people like that, by the way. People who think they know better than the Jews what anti-Semitism is. We do have a name for that. But anyway. And then he says that it's the Republicans who are redefining. And oh, by the way, this hearing where they've got the 3 university presidents and they're talking about anti-Semitic activity on those campuses, he said it's to protect the government of Israel. My reaction to that is that it doesn't matter what party you are, that there's an idiot at that level in Congress should bother you. But if you would watch the entire hearing, you will hear that Republicans actually care about the problem and Democrats care about how can we distract your attention with ridiculous things that have nothing to do with the problem. When Chuck Schumer told the president of Colombia last year that their political problems were only with Republicans, he was not kidding. It's very sad. And I mean, I'm not a partisan guy, really. I mean, I'm dealing with, Jewish values and, fighting anti-Semitism, etc. But, when you ask me about a spectacle like that, I say, I don't see how a Jewish person can pull the lever for a Democrat when the situation looks like that. Again, Haley Stevens, different story. Find a Democrat like that, fine, great. But if the Democrat you're talking about is a card-carrying anti-Semite like AOC, the members of the squad, or anybody who's beholden to that, obviously not. Because it's not just the DSA. Sadly, it's much more widespread.
I think that's totally, I agree. And for instance, Biden's anti-Semitism task force, it was totally useless. I mean,
do you know the interesting thing, besides, along comes the Trump administration, and now I'm one of his religious advisors to the Religious Liberty Commission. Great. But when Biden was in charge, it's not that the administration wouldn't talk to our organization. Never mind that it's Orthodox rabbis in American public policy, largest rabbinic public policy organization in America. We're not going to ask them their opinion on anti-Semitism. But they didn't talk to ZOA. They didn't talk about combating anti-Semitism movement. They didn't even talk to the Simon Wiesenthal Center. They wouldn't talk to any organization that was willing to call out anti-Semites by name on the left. Jonathan Greenblatt, ADL, he's a Democratic operative, a partisan operative from the beginning. He never had any real attachment to the scholarly study of anti-Semitism or anything like that. ADL chose him because he's a good fundraiser, but he's totally out of his depth. And it took him until 2021 to say, the left really has an anti-Semitism problem. But even though now he recognized it, he didn't call for Ilhan Omar to be booted. He didn't call for Rashida Tlaib to be replaced. He called for Tucker Carlson to leave Fox. which was a great move because now that Tucker Carlson left Fox, he's much more anti-Semitic than he was ever before. You know,
Look, I
I
agree.
don't know if it was because of the Fox impact or what it was, but there was a lid on his patrician, old style, blue blooded, casual anti Semitism. Somebody who does research on this type of thing said the thing about Tucker is whatever you call him, he will embrace. So now that the ADL spent all that energy calling him an anti-Semite, an anti-Semite, an anti-Semite, it's like, you know what? I'm going to prove you right.
I don't know. I don't know if I'd
You know,
blame
well, he's certainly way worse than he ever was when the ADL was criticizing him for being an anti-Semite. They were criticizing him for saying things like the Democrats are trying to change the population balance in the United States through immigration, which was true. And it had nothing to do with anti-Semitism either way. And so the ADL should not have gotten involved in the thing. If they're talking about, if their job is to talk about anti-Semitism, they should not be opining on things that have nothing to do with it and only manage to offend certain of our allies.
right.
You know,
Yeah. Look, I mean, you
by the
make
way, they managed to goad Elon Musk, who's a deep friend of the Jewish community. I mean, he's still, as far as I know, he's still wearing a hostage necklace or bracelet or something. But he certainly was after his trip to Israel. And they got him to retweet a hashtag which turned out to have been generated by an actual anti Semite whose goal wasn't to improve the ADL, it was to destroy the ADL.
well, I would quibble with that Musk thing since he brought back all the Nazis and gave them blue checks.
Well, you know what was going on before then? We had a Twitter that decided that Donald Trump is dangerous, but the Ayatollah is fine.
Right, right.
That's not, no. It's like, you know, when you have an open platform, you're going to have Nazis on your open platform. When you don't have an open platform, you're saying that the Ayatollah calling for genocide is okay.
But should the Nazis be getting monetized? He's paying them.
I don't know who's monetized and demonetized. There's a whole complexity to that algorithm. You'd have to point and say
Right.
this guy should not be getting monetized, and then you can file a complaint with Twitter.
Oh, there's a lot. It's
You know, I'm sure there are because they're not going to be tracking individually every one, but certainly you should be reporting them. And they have demonetized people. That much they do.
yeah. I mean, look, everything you say about the left, there's serious problems on the left. I'm not going to deny that. But I could point out, I was just watching Joe Rogan was praising the Hail Hitler song, hosted a Holocaust denier, Tucker. This guy Theo Von, who was at the inauguration, went on an anti-Semitic rant. Russell Brand's praising. These are all Trump fans with connections. You know, what scares me...
I would never have envisioned Russell Brand as a right winger.
Yeah.
He's not. I mean,
Yeah.
Joe Rogan is his own story.
Right.
He does, you know, he did come down on the side of Trump, but he is his own guy. He's not politically to one side or the other. That's part of why his podcast has been so popular. But yeah, he's absolutely ventured into anti-Semitism. What was very interesting is to watch, you know, people were always being very anxious to say, oh, that guy likes Trump, therefore Trump is responsible for whatever he, like, you know, meanwhile, the guy who shot up the Tree of Life synagogue hated Trump. Why did he hate Trump? Because Trump's surrounded by Jews.
Yeah, I know. I'm not.
You know, there's
I'm not
a lot.
blaming Trump.
The right wing anti-Semites hate Trump by and large.
Yeah,
I know they hate Trump for the right wing anti-Semites hate Trump for all the right reasons.
Yeah, I'm not blaming Trump. What I'm saying is my fear with the Republican Party is there's a lot of data now that says there's a real generational issue with anti-Semitism. So I don't fear Trump. I fear
what you have to worry about is what's coming off the college campus. And that is a problem of the left more than the right, but it's a problem on both sides. And it's ridiculous. These indoctrinated idiots are going to be the next generations. You know, my daughter just went through her graduation as a physician's assistant, along with two women who dedicated their long coats to the suffering people of Palestine. You know, these are people. I mean, we've already seen this in the medical field, like there that famous video from Australia. There are people coming out who are absolutely anti-Semitic, and give them the opportunity, they're going to actually treat a Jewish patient poorly. That is where America is headed, and it's really not it's not a partisan problem. You got left wingers doing this and right wingers doing this. Do I think politically that left wing anti-Semitism is much worse right now? For sure, because this whole justifying of Palestine never meant anything other than how do we disenfranchise the Jews from Judea? That's what it's still being used for, and that's why Yasser Arafat picked it up. They're like the hermit crab of people. Once the Jews stopped calling themselves Palestinians, they said, we're the Palestinians, and we've always been the Palestinians. And so that is the indoctrinated moronicism that is now popular on campus. Note that, by the way, when I was a college student, you had students who were, at least they were protesting real genocides. Darfur, Bosnia, Rwanda, real human rights crises. Right now, the state of human rights is getting worse year over year, according to all the national aid organizations that monitor this. And the only thing that they have widespread chants about on campus is Palestine. One of the congressmen, and I'm forgetting now who it was, he asked them, has there been a protest about the Chinese treatment of Uyghur Muslims on your campus? Nope. Has there been a protest about what's going on in Syria? And again, nope. Has there been a call for the eradication of anybody except Jews? And you're going, nope.
Yeah, or the Afghan war, which actually involved
all of this stuff has taken over the dialogue. I appreciate the opportunity to have had this dialogue.
Yes, thank you.